might be even compatible with this abd, with this servant function. So in other words, the concern to protect the transcendence of God on one hand, but also to fully explain Jesus Christ, after all, in the Gospels, he comes across as a person with one nature, one character, a number of traits that you can describe very well, and you can preach, of course, every Sunday on various aspects of the life of Jesus, that he nevertheless was divine. Well, that was precisely then the problem where everybody diverged. Did I come anywhere close to you with my answer? Yeah. Oh, okay.
Other questions?
Yeah.
Hi, my name is George Garcia. I'm studying international relations with a focus on Latin America. But I have been thinking a lot about how religion is taught in public education, especially in K through 12. And I was wondering, I know this isn't exactly your field or what you're studying, but what would you say is the best way to teach Islam in a way that wouldn't offend or scare off Christians or make them feel threatened about the religion, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Or the other way around. How can you sit down with a fundamentalist or reformist Muslim and explain Christianity to this person? I'm very grateful that you raised this point, because you can, of course, ask yourself, okay, now you have heard a more or less learned presentation here about the conflicts among the Christians in the 500s. What's the relevance of all of this? What do you take away from that, apart from this being just, well, I hope, solid scholarship? There is a point, and that is, remember I mentioned this idea here of convergence? So in other words, if you know about these Christian roots that Islam has, Islam did not emerge sui generis out of the revelations that Muhammad received on a mountain near Mecca, which incidentally is called Hira. So there is a remembrance of this particular term, because that's, of course, the name of the Eastern Arab Christian city of Hira in Mesopotamia. Anyway, it's of immediate relevance, because if you emphasize to Muslims, look, if you are willing, I will lead you to an understanding of the Quran, but forget for a moment the tradition that was formulated 200 years later. Okay, I mean, we know about Muhammad, for example, only because a biography was written 200 years later. The word Muhammad appears only 3 times as such as Muhammad in the Quran. So we do not even know who revealed the Quran. For all we know is that what we talk about as the revelation of the Quran was the communal work of scribes who were deeply steeped in all of the scriptures of Christianity, including also all non-canonical ones of previous centuries, and put together what we can maybe call a concordance of all of the Christian writings. This is the original meaning of Islam, by the way. So the whole point here is, if it is possible to, so let me first answer the question of you and me sitting down with a Salafi or even jihadi Muslim. I mean, jihadi just before he engages in jihad, obviously. Muslim, and you can somehow sit down and be patient with each other, then you and I would say, look now, there are Christian roots. And these roots, furthermore, appear in the Quran in mostly convergent form. So that there is actually a lot of communality between Christianity and Islam. And if you are willing, then we count you, Muslims, among those who inherited the common concordance heritage of Judaism and Christianity, even though Christianity within itself was, of course, deeply conflicted, as I pointed out. So we are heirs of all 3 things. And so the Islamic Quranic revelation is therefore just another version of the revelatory tradition that comes out of the Middle East. Now, let's turn it also around, of course, since you originally asked the question from the other side, and that is how can we could you reformulate it so that I can be precise with my answer?
How do I want to put this? How could we help Christians see the humanity in Islam,
Yeah.
without like threatening their own sense of identity in Christianity?
Yeah. So that would be then we among ourselves with, is any Muslim present? I looked around earlier and didn't think there was one. But I mean, obviously I'm not saying anything offensive, but I merely want to be very sensitive in my answer. And that is, we among ourselves should draw away from the multiple prejudices that we have about Islam. And they are, of course, countless. I'm not even mentioning now the ones that populated the Middle Ages. I'm talking only about, let's say, contemporary ones. And among these prejudices are, number one, these Orientalists who peel these onion peels away, think that Islam and the rise of Islam has to be explained primarily out of these Islamic sources. But that has run its course now. We cannot use the Islamic tradition anymore. Let me give you the example. The Muhammad biography, the so-called Sira, S-I-R-A, was composed in the final version in 823. So you see the 200 years that I was talking about. That is for the first time the source where we then learn about Muhammad was born in 570, he grew up in Mecca, he had his first revelations in 610, and so on and so forth. Among ourselves, if we open ourselves to what the Christians had to say about the rise of Islam in the 600s, like I did here in my presentation, then we would come to the conclusion, well, the origins of Islam can be nicely compared to what Christianity was all about in the 500s and all of the problems that it experienced. You see them continued here in the origins of Islam. This will open us up to a view of late antiquity that is much larger than just these few years of the early 600s, when between 610, when the first revelations came, and 632, when the Prophet Muhammad, according to Islamic tradition, died, which is a very narrow focus on the origins of Islam. So, of course, you can retell the story of Muhammad 1,000 times, and I do this actually in my history survey classes. But then, of course, a week later I say, okay, what you have just now learned is not history, but religion, okay? The religious interpretation of what, how Muslims viewed the rise of Islam. Now let me tell you what the Christians had to say when these origins of Islam occurred. So in short, if you give up this Orientalist approach, this notion that through philology, you can clarify these Islamic sources, and through all of these traditions that are biased and have certain religious points of views, you can come to some sort of historical background or origin. It won't work. What will work, however, is a historical context that you establish, where you have then a much better knowledge, certainly of Christianity in late antiquity, and particularly these curious people called Trithias, who usually, by the way, Orientalists dismiss them as just minor people who were discussing a refinement of theological approaches to the problems of Christology and theology. These were people over which, first of all, these were doctrines over which people killed each other, number one, as Jenkins said. But then furthermore, this was a real widespread among monks of Syria, where Islam probably originated. Monks of Syria, where lots of monks were Trithias, and where probably lots of Arabs were Trithias. Otherwise, why would there be this battle against the Mushrikun, who were the alleged associators? So in short, what I'm saying is, taking the traditional Orientalist approach, talking now only among ourselves, not Muslims, although Muslims, in a way, should listen in, so to speak. As people who take in what happened in the among Christians in the 500s, we are taking this much wider contextual approach of, well, that's what happened in Christianity, and that had such and such effects on the Arabs who were in this border region between the two empires and who were exposed already to the full blast of all of these different Christianities, and who worked out this conflict among themselves. You see, that's the important point, because of course the big Christian church then subsequently, I assume we all know this, of course. There is still today the Coptic Church of Egypt that is monophysitic. There are monophysite Christians in Egypt are very defensive against Catholicism, against Greek Orthodoxy. Greek Orthodoxy, Catholicism, Protestantism, and then further 19th century developments, including then also Mormonism. They all follow this Chalcedonian tradition, about which I didn't say much. And then there are the Nestorians, who are the neglected Christians. They are actually the Christians who then, when eventually the when the Muslims destroyed the Persian Empire, were represented all along the so-called Silk Road. So Christians today in China are very likely to be Nestorians. So the Nestorian community is very small. It has suffered tremendously under the ISIS takeover of parts of Iraq, because the representatives of ISIS were very anti-Christian, and the predominant number of Christians in Iraq are the Nestorians, or the descendants of the Nestorians, the so-called Eastern Church. So what I'm saying here is the larger perspective that I'm recommending gives us a much better understanding of what Islam is all about.
Thank you very much. If you could join me once again in thanking Professor von Sivers for his visit, that would be great.
Thank you.